Hello there, welcome back to the channel, it's great to see you here. What I want to talk about this week is reverb. In this video what I'm going to do is explain 5 of the most common reverb types that we use in music production, and I want to try and explain how you can use them to just build in some extra dimension to your mixes. I'm going to demonstrate how each one sounds, and I'm going to give you a typical application for each one. And if you stick around to the end, the little YouTube teaser there, stick around to the end and I'll share a couple of tips of how you can actually make choosing reverb a little bit easier. Okay, so let's get on with the video. So what I want to talk about, or the 5 main types of reverbs that I want to talk with you about today, are room reverbs, chambers, halls, plates and spring. Also in there will be ambiances, and they, for me, tend to fall into the room category, but they're pretty common, and I do use them in my mixing every time I mix. So what I want to do is just give you a quick roundup. A lot of you will probably have a good grasp on reverb, but for those of you new to mixing, then I just want to cover some of the basics. Reverb, along with EQ, compression, is one of the main tools that we use to shape our mixes. In a physical space, reverb is sound bouncing off the walls and returning to our ears. Now, it might not only be walls, it is in fact any surface that's within that space. So furniture, equipment, everything has a reflective quality in terms of sound, and those reflections are what we hear or perceive as reverb. Now, there are thousands of these reflections all coming at us at the same time. Well, no, not at the same time, at varying times. And this is how the brain is able to take that information and give us a sense of the size of a room, the makeup of the room, the shape of the room. Now, these reflections, because there are so many and at varying times, all kind of smush into one sound. All those reflections where you just can't hear any individual echoes. They are in fact echoes, but they're so close to, there are multiples of them, and they're so close together that we just perceive them as one big kind of block of sound. Now, delay, in contrast, are those individual echoes. When we do hear sound coming back to us and we can hear distinct repeats, that's delay. But obviously we're not talking about delay today, we're talking about reverb. Now, before we dive into talking any more about reverb, I think it's worthwhile just recapping on some of the terminology around reverb. Those controls and parameters that you see on reverb plugins or reverb units, if you have any. Let's just talk a little bit about those so that you've got a good grasp, a good understanding of what they do. The first one is pre-delay. Now, this is usually in milliseconds, and this is a time distance that you can input that separates the dry signal and the beginning of the reverb. And we use it quite a lot to build in that separation, and it also helps to keep some clarity with regard to the original recording. Now, pre-delay doesn't actually happen in real life. What happens in real life is the reverb starts immediately, but it starts at a very, very low level. So what we're able to do with pre-delay is exaggerate that and separate the two more distinctly for reasons I've just explained. The next phrase is early reflections. Reverb is kind of a catch-all phrase. We use it to describe the whole effect, the whole event. But really, reverb is split into 3 phases. The first phase is our early reflections, and that's the first reaction to the sound, the original sound in a space. Then you get the sustaining element of the reverb, which is often called the tail or late reflections, and in actual fact is the reverb part of that all-encompassing phrase that we do tend to use, being reverb. That middle phase there is the reverb section of the reverb. Okay, and then you get the decay, and that's where the reverb just dies away naturally. So early reflections, they are typically the first and the loudest room reflections to reach your ears after the direct sound. These are key to how our brain is able to distinguish the size of the room, the makeup of the room, if it's a wooden room, if it's a brick room, the height of the ceilings, everything. The first ones I want to talk about are hall reverbs. So these are reverbs based on the characteristics of large halls and auditoriums, concert halls, that kind of thing. They typically have a reasonably long decay time, sort of 2 to 3 seconds, but that doesn't mean to say that they are the limits. Really, you can create or select reverb times within that style, whatever you want to use. Or sometimes for cinematic scores, you may go even longer, or for something more atmospheric, you could go really long again. Typically, the quality of the sound, the texture of the sound is lush and deep, and it will significantly thicken up the sound. And this is where reverb sometimes gets a bad reputation, because this type of reverb is one of the worst offenders for giving you muddy mixes. Typically, this type of reverb would be used for orchestral music, any kind of acoustic instrument such as pianos, strings, horns even. And because it's such a big, lush sound, it has the effect of actually pushing the direct sound back into the soundstage. So you can use it in a creative way just to start building in depth into mixes and pushing sounds back so that you can make a distinction between those instruments and, say, the singer at the front of the stage. The next reverb is a chamber reverb. Now, chambers are artificial rooms that were built, historically built into the basements of studios. These chambers were purpose-built, and they were purpose-built to have reflective walls. And in those chambers, they placed a speaker to play back the sound. They placed a microphone to pick up the reflections of that sound. Okay, and that was then fed back into the control room in the studio for the mix. In terms of sound or sonic quality, think of being in a bathroom, basically. It's a bit of a cliche, but a tiled bathroom, and you can imagine the sound, the reflections that come back are very distinct and are sort of more controlled than a regular room. Now, chambers are a great alternative to using a hall reverb. If you wanted that similar sort of lush, thickening effect, you can get that with a chamber without it taking up as much space in the mix as a hall does. And blending the two is a really great approach to using the qualities of these lush sounding reverbs without things getting muddy, basically. The famous ones are Abbey Road Studios and Capitol Studios. They have, I think, Sunset Sound as well, very famous chambers, and we are lucky enough to be able to sample them through some of the plugin manufacturers that have been able to recreate them for us. And that's great because they are so versatile. Chambers, you can use them on anything, basically. Acoustic instruments, pianos, vocals, guitars, strings, brass. They are so versatile. And they're one of my kind of favourite reverbs to use. Now, these two, in terms of decay time, they can be initially quite small. Chambers weren't that big, but you can also use fairly long decay times with them as well. So the next reverb is a room reverb. So we're kind of going down in size. We start with the concert hall, we've gone down to a chamber, and now we're getting into rooms. And within rooms, we kind of get ambiances as well. Rooms can range from small to large. So there is crossover between the decay times of all these reverbs. It's just that the qualities are different. The makeup of the room, the way our brain interprets the sound, they are what are different. So typically room reverbs are smaller spaces, from ambiances to large rooms, like studios, I guess. Now, I love using room reverbs to add depth and realism to guitars and to vocals. In fact, any closed mic'd instrument. It gives these sounds a sense of liveness, like you're in the room with them. And they are great to layer into mixes because they don't take up that much space, but they can have quite an effect in giving sounds their own space in the mix. Use room reverbs when you need more small, intimate sounding reverbs. Now, in my head, ambiences fall into this category. Ambiences, for me, range from 300 milliseconds up to a second maximum, but that's not a rule. There are longer ambiences. But it's just how I like to kind of separate them in my head. Now, the thing about ambiences is that they are mainly early reflections. It's how we understand the space that the instrument is in. So blending the two, ambiences with other reverbs that we've spoken about already, you can really develop quite a rich sounding soundscape. Drums are really good to put into a space like that, as are electric guitars. And I do that all the time. They're just great for adding a sense of space without overpowering the sound. And for me, ambiences are more about capturing a feeling than an actual reverb as such. It's more about how it makes the part feel in the mix. So a typical use for this would be on like rock vocals, classic rock vocals, where you want the vocalist to feel upfront and aggressive or just full of power and energy. And so that ambient type of reverb can help do that while still keeping a natural sound. Next, we move on to the mechanical reverbs. So this is the spring reverbs and the plate reverbs. Just going to talk about spring first. Probably really familiar with spring reverbs. I didn't realise, but these were initially introduced by Hammond for Hammond organs in like the 30s and the 40s. I didn't realise that. I just assumed they came along with guitars in the sort of 50s. But spring reverb came about much sooner than that. I'm sure you're familiar with the sound of spring reverb. It's really unique. And if you think of a small box with either one spring or a series of springs with a transducer on one end and a pickup or a microphone on the other, the sound is very metallic and quite boingy, springy, and it's really great on guitars and any short sort of percussive sound, really. Snare drums, for example, that's an interesting use for spring reverb. So the second mechanical reverb in this list and last reverb in this list is the plate reverb. This is so versatile. So imagine a big box with a metal plate suspended inside the box, and again it's the same principle. There's a transducer and there's a pickup or a microphone. Sound is fed into the box through the transducer, picked up by the microphone and fed back to the control room to be blended into the mix. And the different metals that can be used to create the plate themselves, the physical plate themselves, impart a complete tonal change to the quality of that reverb sound. There's no end really to how you can treat that plate in that box to create a different tonal profile to the plate reverb. In terms of its sound, think of if someone was holding a large metal sheet and hit it with something, you can imagine that sort of metallic ringing sound that is typical of plate reverbs. Maybe not ringing, but more of a shimmering sound. These two range from short decay times to quite long decay times. So it's useful to think of reverbs really more in terms of their texture and their tonal quality than their actual length sometimes, because they all cross over and you can have the combination of a long decay time on one reverb that is quite dark after using EQ, combined with another reverb that's quite bright sounding, but quite short in decay time. And they can have a similar feel in terms of length. So it can get a bit confusing when it comes to length. So I think it's more helpful to think of reverbs in terms of tonal character, the texture of them, the type of room or space, and how that would sound in real life. Plate reverbs, typical applications are on vocals and on snares. Also acoustic guitars as well. But that doesn't mean to say you can't use it on anything else. Just experiment, and if it feels right to you, use it. If you want to put a plate on strings, you know, go ahead and do that. I'd love to hear it. So if you do that, send it to me. That'll be interesting. These plates are, as I've said, in a really large box. They're typically very heavy, and in terms of sonic quality, they're quite dense sounding. But what's different about plates, or typical of plates, is the initial attack is quite bright and quick. The sound can start bright and then quickly decay into something quite dark. And that's what's so lovely about plate reverbs and so distinctive about them. And that's why they work so well on vocals. So now you know the 5 main types of reverb that we're going to talk about today and where they came from. Each one has got its own sonic character, its uniqueness. And so choosing the right one for your mix depends on a number of factors. Also, your own personal taste. So let's dive into the DAW and listen to some of these reverbs in action. So I've gathered together some random tracks here so that I can demonstrate the different qualities of these reverb types. The purpose of this is to just demonstrate the sonic textures, or the different feelings, the sense of the size of the room that each one gives you, so that will hopefully imprint in your memory. So when you go looking for a reverb, you have a better idea of what it is you're looking for. It's also something I wanted to point out is that not everybody likes reverb. Don't feel as though you have to use it. One guy I worked with at the BBC, he hated reverb. He never used it. He just used delays on everything. And that's perfectly acceptable, because if you use a very short delay, like a slap delay or a 16th note delay, that can be perceived as reverb, like a small room, okay? The benefit of using delays over reverbs could be, or is, that they take up less room and they can result in a more kind of defined mix, or less chance of that muddiness, that ghosting bloom that reverb brings can sometimes be dark and muddy, and some people really just don't like that texture, and that is fine. The other thing I want to point out is that these are not the best settings, these are not the best applications. This is just how I've developed my knowledge and have found that these settings and these types of reverbs work really well on these types of instruments. Okay, so it's just, I wanted to share that with you because it works for me, and so it might work for you too. Okay, so let's start with the hall, the concert hall, the auditorium. I've got a piano and I've got a horn here. These are both from a jazz mix, so let's just take a listen to these without any effects. Okay, and then the horn. Okay, so 2 of them. So quite dry, close. Let's put them in an atmosphere that is suitable or expected by the listener for this style of music. So that would be legitimately a hall. So let's look at that. So the 2 halls that I've got set up here are, I'm calling them short and long. That's just how they're labelled in my template. And it's just basically 2 hall reverbs of some sort of differing length. In this case, though, they're the same length. They're just quite a little bit different tonally to one another. The reverb I've gone with for the piano is piano hall. So let's take a listen to that. And when I press stop, you can hear the decay, and you can hear the texture of the reverb more clearly. So that's sounding lush and natural for a piano. Let's listen to the horn next. And I'm just using a different send to another instance of Seventh Heaven with clear hall against a 2-second decay. But the quality of this reverb is just slightly different to the piano. Let's just take a listen to that. Okay, it's quite subtle, the difference between the two, but what I like about the piano reverb is it seems to ring out more or have a brighter sense to it when the piano is played with more velocity. And what I like about that reverb is that it has an overall brighter, more diffuse quality to it. The high frequencies are really accentuating the metallic nature of the horn. I just think it sounds really lush and really lovely. Okay, so let's remind ourselves, let's mute those reverbs, let's listen to it dry, and then I'll bring the reverbs in. Okay, so that's a hall, expansive, large. What I liked about these particular settings on the Acoustic is that they don't feel muddy to me. So that's a plus. So next up, I want to talk about ambiences. This is that small space that I like to use on close mic'd instruments. Guitar cabs being a case in point. Got some guitars here for you to listen to. What this is about is just putting a little bit of space around them to take away, to bring more of a live sense, really. That's what this is here for. It's to make it feel as though you're listening to this and you're stood in the room with them. These are the guitars. Okay, I press stop, there's nothing there, it's just dead. Let's bring in this ambience and see what that does to the sound. So I've exaggerated that there, but you can get a real sense of them now being in a quite echoey, small, tight space. Let me do that again for you. I'll mute it and then bring it in. And you can hear it when I press stop. What I'm using for this is Valhalla Room. It's a medium room setting, but it's at 560 milliseconds. That falls in that ambience category for me. And it just does a great job of making the guitars that otherwise would be very, very dry feel as though they're in some sort of real space. Some terminology, recap, pre-delay. So there's a little bit of pre-delay there, 10 milliseconds. Probably arguable whether you can actually detect it or not, but it's there in any case. And that's what's put in the tiny, shortest distance there between the dry sound and when the reverb starts. Then you can see we've got late and early, and that refers to those reflections that I spoke about at the start of the video. And then there's a high cut here in reverbs, usually some way of EQing the reverb. And this is applying a high cut at 8K. And that darkens the reverb down, and what that serves to do is push the reverb even further back into the soundstage and help with that depth perception in the mix. Instead of, or as well as a reverb on selected guitar parts, will apply another reverb to create layers. And so it's common for me to use a chamber or a spring reverb in that respect. I'm just going to bring down this, the reverb ambience there on these guitars a little bit. Let's listen to this lead guitar, first of all. Okay, dry. I'm going to add that ambience to it to just lift it a little bit. All right, and so let's now play around with the spring reverb. Activate the spring reverb. The spring I'm using in this instance is from Softtube, called Spring Reverb, imaginatively. I'm just going to leave this as it, I think this is how it defaults to, but you get to choose the amount of springs. Do you remember I explained that you can go from one to multiple numbers of springs in a spring reverb tank? So this is set to 2. Let's fade this up and see how it changes the tone of the lead guitar. And you can hear there in the decay that springy nature of it, that boingy nature of it. There's a movement there, a modulation to the way it decays, and that's part of that's so signature of a spring reverb, and it's great for guitars and probably Hammond organs. The other thing that I like to go to with lead guitars is a chamber. I'm going to take the spring out and let's just try this chamber and see how the different sort of textural feeling you get now with that versus the spring. So it doesn't have that modulation, it doesn't have that movement, but you do very much get a sense of it being a chamber, a small room with highly reflective walls. What I'm using here is the Hitsville chambers from UAD, which is really great, and it has got a great graphic here to demonstrate exactly sort of the size of a chamber. I'll show you the Abbey Road chambers in a minute, and that is quite different. That is more like a bathroom. But this is chamber 2. You can see it's got sloping ceiling. You can see the speakers placed in the room and a microphone to pick up the sound from the reflected sound from the walls and the ceilings. Chamber 1 looks quite different, but it still has the sort of an apex roof there, but it's got more of a wall to it. And again, a completely different type of speaker arrangement there, which in turn will have the tone of the reflections will change because of that. And these microphones will get moved about to suit the style of the song, to suit what it is that the mix engineer or the recording engineer is going for. The Abbey Road chambers, here's the graphic for it. You can see it is a much smaller room with a B&W speaker there and a series of microphones. And this has got pillars in it. So sound reflections, don't forget that they reflect off the objects in the room as well, and that adds to the character. Let's see what this reverb sounds like. Different quality again. Let me go between the two. So start with Abbey Road and then I'll flick over to the Hitsville. So it feels longer. You can sense that it's a bigger room in correlation to the diagrams. What I hope you do hear, though, is that sense of it being a smaller space. It's not a hall. Chambers, you recall, are so versatile, you can use them on anything. So let's try that out. Next, I've got an acoustic guitar. Let's see what this sounds like with, first of all, the chamber, and then we'll talk about a couple of other options. Okay, sounds great, doesn't it? With a chamber on it, really nice. And that is the Hitswell chamber, which is I just used an electric guitar space. And what I did, I switched the actual chamber from chamber 2 to chamber 1. Let's go back to chamber 2 during the playback and see if we can detect a difference. Quite different. This room felt, probably with a combination of the changing speaker, the changing microphone as well, it just felt thicker. It felt like it added a bit more body to the guitar, which is great. Get rid of the chamber for the minute because I want to go back now to another ambience. This is a second option that I use a lot for just a general ambience for instruments. And it's back to my old friend, the Valhalla Room plugin again. This time, I'm gone with a preset called Largewood Room. This is a really popular preset that was built into the Lexicon 480, and the Valhalla people have done their own version of it here. Now, the reverb mode is it's falling inside a large chamber as its type, and the reverb, the decay time is 4.49 seconds here, no pre-delay. And that high cut is about a little bit higher, it's about 8.5K. So a tiny bit more high frequency, but not that you would particularly notice, I don't think. Let's check this out on the acoustic. So what this is about is an ambience, and so it's putting it in a live space. 1.49 seconds is probably going to feel more like a medium-sized room, really, or a studio room. Let's just listen to it and see what it sounds like. Yeah, similar to a chamber, actually. It has that same kind of quality, which, given that it's a large chamber reverb mode, I guess it probably would. Okay, let's just bed this in a little bit more. It's a bit too much of it, I think, at the moment. That's more like it. What I'm looking for is this shorter. It's just a sense of it being in a room, a small room, as if you were there in the, placing the mics and what have you in the studio. Bypass this and bring it in. So it does a great job, increases the width of the recording as well. So that is another ambience. It's a little bit bigger than the first ambience, which was 500-ish milliseconds. Here we've gone to 1.5 milliseconds. But the goal for me of these ambiences is just to put these dry instruments in a space. A real sounding acoustic space. And then what I can do then on top of that is decide to use another longer reverb if I wanted to, like a chamber. Or a plate. Let's look at that, because plate is a really good choice for acoustic guitar. Yeah, just want to pull that ambience down a little bit because I want you to be able to hear the plate. This is what I would do. I would layer a plate on top of an ambience. Plate I've got here is Abbey Road plates, set to beautiful short plate. And this short plate is very short indeed. It looks like it's set to about a second. If you think about the ambience, that's 1.5 seconds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this reverb time up to, let's say, 2 seconds. Now let's check this plate out. metallic, bright sounding plate. In here we've got some presets, and Beautiful Short Plate is a preset for acoustic guitar. Let's go with acoustic guitar 1. That's coming up at a 3-second decay there. Let's see if this is any different. I prefer that. It's not quite as zingy sounding, not quite as metallic sounding, but something to remember, it's all well and good as listening to things in solo here. When you start placing these things back into a mix, these reverbs will start to disappear. They won't feel as intense as they did when they were in solo. And so obviously that's always the final thing, is to use solo to pick your quality, the texture, and perhaps the length of the reverb, but you're going to have to set level whilst listening to the whole mix. So that's play on acoustic in combination with the ambience. So if we just mute those and bring them in. Okay, different texture, different feel, different brightness, but similar to a chamber. So with play, you've just got so many options. Let's move on to strings now. Strings, what's its natural habitat? Well, a concert hall again, isn't it? But not only that, chamber works really well on strings. Two completely different feels. Let's listen to the strings dry. There is reverb on these stems, so bear that in mind. But I tend to listen to what I've been given, and if there's reverb already on a track, I'll look to exaggerate that even more. If once in the whole mix, things start to feel a little bit dry. So let's go to what we might first go to, and that would be a hall. I've got the clear hall again there, which was the 2-second decay time. So lovely, lush, non-muddy sounding hall reverb there for strings. And it just accentuates what's already on the recording, which is what I really like. Listen to, I'll play it again and then I'll mute it, and just listen to how the reverb affects the distance. This reverb, this whole reverb is just pushing things back in the soundstage. And so when I mute it, you'll hear the strings come forward and feel more close to you, more intimate, and like they're in a smaller space. Interestingly affecting the tonal quality of the strings as well. They feel darker with this reverb in and slightly quieter and being pushed far back into the soundstage. They can be really useful qualities to have in placing strings in a mix, particularly strings that might be a bit on the bright side or scratchy or something like that. Let's audition a chamber now. And I'm going to return to the Hitsville chamber and use their dark strings preset. Let's check this out. Much shorter, denser sound, not as lush sounding and big sounding as the hall is, as you would expect. Totally different textures depending on the style of music. and depending what you're trying to fit these strings in with. If it's a sparse mix, you would probably go for something longer, larger, more lush, like the concert hall. If it's a busy mix and you're fitting this in with drums, guitars, vocals, bass guitar as well, you just would, the concert hall may not work. It'd just be too much. It's too much information for the mix. So you want something that's smaller, tighter, grittier even. And that will just really work better in that scenario, I think. So it's all about texture. It's all about perception of the size of the room that these things are in and the reflectivity of the walls and the objects within that room. Let's check out vocal now. Two types of reverbs that work well on vocals are rooms and plates. Okay, that's not to say you can't use a concert hall, because you do get singers in concert halls. But for this, I think I've demonstrated concert hall enough for you. So let's move on to look at rooms on vocals. The first room I've got set up is, so it's an ambience that I use on vocal. And again, it's about putting the vocalist in a room, in a live space. So this, it has a reverb time of just over a second. So let's check out what this does. See if this puts this vocal inside a live room. So it's this reverb vocal 2 here, down here, and I'll start to fade this up across this vocal.
Keep my head above water, don't know if I can swim any longer. But hey, I'm coming around. I feel my lungs explode with a massive forward dose. All the pressure.
Really sense of a room, a reasonably sized room there. What you would typically associate perhaps with a studio space, a studio room. And then if you wanted less of that effect, if you wanted to make the room feel smaller and a bit more intimate, you'd bring down the reverb time to something like, let's say 750 milliseconds. See what that sounds like.
Keep my head above water, don't know if I can swim any longer.
Much smaller sounding space. And so once I've done that, once I've taken this close mic'd vocalist and put them in a room, then we can think about enhancing that vocal with another type of reverb. And typically I'll go to a plate for that. Here I've got the A plate set up in the Lexicon 480. Let's start to fade that up and see how that then starts to change this vocal.
Keep my head above water, don't know if I can swim any longer. But hey, I'm coming around. I feel my lungs explode with a massive forward dose. All the pressure.
Okay, this plate isn't set terrifically long. It's 1.5 seconds, and it has a lot of high frequencies, I should say, rolled off with a high cut filter at 6K. So quite dark sounding. Another thing to point out is that the pre-delay setting is at 92 milliseconds. So it's quite a longish gap between when the dry signal ends and the reverb starts to bloom. And that is a really nice effect to use on vocals to keep the vocals sounding clear and clean. Play this vocal and then I'll mute these effects.
Keep my head above water, don't know if I can swim any longer. But hey, I'm coming around. I feel my lungs explode with a massive...
You just totally hear the voice just moving from one large room into a smaller room and then into nothing, into deadness. So great choice of reverbs for vocals then is the first step to put it into a small ambience, and then secondly to layer on top of it some sort of plate or even a room reverb, another room reverb that's longer, maybe another 2-second reverb, something like that. But that's the concept anyway that I approach with vocals. So hopefully you can try that and see if it works for you. Lastly, I want to talk about drums. I use the same approach with drums as I do with vocals. I want to take these drums and make sure they feel as though they're in a live sounding space, and then I will layer extra reverbs on top to create an even greater sense of sort of brightness, colour, sustain to the snare and to the toms. With drums, it all depends on what you're given. If you're given room mics, then you would probably use less reverb than if you just had overheads and the shells. So let's take a listen at what we've got here and then try some reverbs out. Okay, so hopefully you heard that, how the room mics and the overheads have contributed to the size and the way that we're able to imagine the room that those drums are in. So all I want to do is just enhance that a little bit more. I'd need to do more if we didn't have room mics, but we do. So let's work with what we've got. First step then is for me is to put these in a room, a bigger room than what we've been provided already, accentuating or exaggerating what's already in the recording, providing it fits in the mix, of course. One of my favourites is Ocean Way Studios, set up on Drums 1 with Ocean Way Room A on the remic mode, and I'm feeding from the drum bus, so all the drums are going to this for the purposes of this demonstration, really. In reality, I may not send the rooms to a room reverb, I probably won't, but for this example I will, so that you can hear what the actual reverb is doing. And that just sounds so realistic to me. So that places these drums in a really nice sounding room. So next what I'd look to do is to selectively use a little bit of plate reverb on the snare. And the purpose of that is just to extend the snare a little bit more, to give it more room in the mix. And I've got the A plate set up again, but this time slightly differently. We're looking at a reverb time of 1.7 seconds, and some pre-delay of 50 milliseconds, but the high filter cut is up full. We're not taking any highs off this sound at all. Let's solo this snare and see what this does. You can hear all that bright high frequencies of the snare. Whereas if we just pull down some, say down to 7K, and I like that. I usually like to darken these things off, plates off. They can sound a little too bright sometimes. Let's check this out in the mix. I'll fade that out and fade it in then to taste. So I like that. What I particularly enjoy about a plate on a snare is the extension that it gives. Makes the snare last a bit longer, more sustain on the snare. Let me mute this and you'll hear it just drop away. Lastly, let's take that high cut all the way out. Let's listen to it now. could hear, you know, you can play around with just these basic settings and really change the textural feel and the distance with which you place the instrument that the reverb is sitting on. So there you have it. 5 types of reverb explained and demonstrated. I hope you found it entertaining. I hope you found it useful. I hope you learned something. Lastly, I've got that little tantalising tip for you on helping you to choose reverbs, deciding on the right reverb for your mix. I've already kind of alluded to them actually throughout the course of this demonstration. The first is to think about the natural habitat of the track you're working with, the vocal, the guitars, strings, piano. Strings and piano sound great in halls or chambers, really suits them because that's where we naturally hear them. Same with guitars. We naturally hear guitars with spring reverbs and with chamber reverbs. Drums, as we just heard, they sound great in rooms and with plates on selected parts of the kit. Just adds more sustain and it just sounds more like what we hear on records. And then vocals, plate reverb or a hall or a room to add lushness and thickness and give them that big sort of spacious feel. The second tip is to choose them in solo so you can really get a sense of the texture and then always go back to the mix to set the level. If it muddies the sound or sets the sound too far back in the mix, then you need to bring the level of the reverb down or you need to think about applying some EQ to the reverb. And thirdly, it would be to choose shorter reverbs if you've got quite a busy mix and to use longer reverbs when you've got the space to use them. If the mix already feels cluttered and busy, then stick with short, small rooms and short plates. But if you've got room, if it's quite a sparse mix or a ballad, then go ahead, go for it and use some of the more longer, lush sounding reverbs like concert halls and longer plates. So hopefully now you're familiar with these 5 types of reverbs and how to place them in your mix. What I'd love to know is which reverbs you use. I've demonstrated the ones I use today, but if you use something different, I'd love to know, so please do let me know in the comments. If you want to see how these reverbs fit into my workflow, then check out this link on screen now to my template series, which will take you step by step through creating your own template, covering everything from the effects channels down through the buses and back to the tracks. So that's all from me in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.